Lisa, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. We've been able to touch offline and discuss a little bit about your journey, and I'm excited to share that with the listeners as well because there's a lot of value people can draw from other people's experiences, and that's the beauty of doing this podcast as well. But before we get into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a bit about yourself, your story, what's brought you here today, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, sure. First of all, I just really so appreciate you creating this space to have this kind of a conversation because these are the important conversations that we all need to be having
Mm.
within our own little communities and orbits. So thanks for that. So my name's Lisa Sugarman. I'm a content creator here in Boston. I do lots of different content creation that all kind of revolves around the same hub of mental health and wellness and suicide awareness and prevention and grief and loss. It's all wound up in that little bucket. And I am also a three-time survivor of suicide loss. And the most unique aspect of my story that's a little different than I think most suicide survivor stories is that I've actually lost my father twice in my life. So I lost my father originally when I was 10 years old, and the story that I was given at the time was that he had died of a heart attack. And I didn't find out the truth that he had actually taken his life for 35 years. I really lived within that narrative that my dad passed away of a heart attack until I was the same age that he was when he died. I was also 45 when I found out that he had actually died by suicide. And that just really just shifted all the gears for me in terms
Mhm.
of what I wanted to do in the world and how I wanted to show up in the world and the content that I was creating. So that kind of put me in a position of mental health advocacy
Mhm.
and creating content to help normalize these kinds of conversations. So that's the very short version of how I got
Mhm.
to where I am now.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that. Thank you. And it's interesting, right? When you say you lost your father twice, and I can definitely understand why. Obviously, I can't put myself in your shoes, but for a lot of people, there's this aspect of trauma where the way I've come to understand it is where you're basically your worldview often gets challenged significantly, or something just comes at you where you have this sense of belief that often gets shattered in a way where you're having to revisit your rationale and some of the way you understand things and the way you see the world. So when you came to understand what happened to your father in reality at the age of 45, what was that like for you in that moment? What were you able to make sense of, and how were you able to navigate that worldview that you had, or that belief you had in terms of what had happened, and then to have to reconcile it again after 35 years, you said?
Yeah, I went through so many different stages and
Mm.
phases during that period of time. It was just a complete upending of everything that I knew to be true. It was my whole history. It was my childhood. It was the man underneath the dad that I knew being someone very different. My father
Mhm.
was one of those people who you never ever had a sense at all that there was anything wrong with my dad in terms of
Mm.
his emotional health. He was vibrant, he was active, he was present and loving and supportive, and he was just a beautiful partner to my mom and a wonderful dad to me. And so there were no signs. So
Mhm.
for me to then all of a sudden have to try and reconcile that the man who I saw one way was absolutely very different than I ever imagined him to be was heartbreaking to me.
Mhm.
It was it was sad, it was chaotic just because
Mhm.
it didn't your brain doesn't make sense of things like that when you find out a truth like that's just so completely different and so jarring and traumatic. than anything you had already been through. I had already been through the loss of him, but I had
Mhm.
never been through the loss of him where he was the one who controlled that loss. That was what just blew me up inside. And the fact that he left my mother with a 10-year-old child to raise, that was the
Mhm.
thing that got to me the most. That was the hardest thing for me to reconcile. And you said something interesting about belief systems.
Mhm.
Made me think of one of the fundamental belief systems that I had always carried with me that
Mhm.
changed so dramatically not long after I learned that my dad had taken his life. I had a similar type of loss where I'd lost a family member by suicide only a year before my father. And that was the first introduction I had ever had to
Mhm.
suicide and that kind of loss. And I ended up just internalizing what I felt that suicide meant. It meant that person had given up. It meant that person couldn't go on. It meant all the things that the stigma of suicide or mental
Mhm.
illness has taught us to that it means.
Mhm.
We know now that it doesn't, but back
Mhm.
then it was a very different understanding around mental illness. And so for me, I had this hardwired belief system that suicide was selfish.
Mhm.
I never talked about it. It was just something that I had internally. And I went through my life until I was an adult, until I found out my own father had died by suicide. And I was bullshit that my father had taken his life and left my mother in a position of having to raise me. My mom was a secretary at a nursing
Mhm.
home. She did not have a high powered, high paying job.
Mhm.
He left her with all the responsibilities of raising a child and raising a family. And I was furious. And it wasn't until I really started to dig deeper into kind of the underlying causes of suicide and the mindset of someone in that position and really understand that it's just a mental illness is an illness.
Mhm.
And it just almost instantaneously changed that belief system to one of
Mhm.
more compassion and understanding. Like, hey, this is a situation that was clearly beyond his control. He wasn't trying to leave us. He didn't
Mhm.
want to leave his wife or his marriage or his daughter. He wanted the pain to stop. And
Mhm.
that's, I think, one of the biggest reasons why I share my story in spaces like this, because I want people to understand that while there's all the human inclination to want to blame the person who took their life for just not being strong enough or not
Mhm.
actively trying hard enough to work on their life, it's beyond that. It's not that at all.
Mhm.
It's an illness that people, if we're lucky, get help for, and some people don't.
Mhm.
So
Absolutely.
that,
And
yeah, that's how it changed for me.
yeah, and what I'm hearing there, I think for you, there was obviously, like you said, there was a stigma around suicide growing up and judgment, right? There's judgment around the person who takes their life, and we tend to judge. And also, when it's happening to you, it can often manifest as anger and resentment too. So it sounds like those were some of those things that were coming up, and you've said that you were able to shift away from it. But what was that process like? Because it could take time, right? And most people never make that move from resentment and anger to compassion. Some people it could take their whole lives to navigate that, and it doesn't always have to be someone they know or a close one taking their life. It could be many aspects when it comes to trauma. How were you able to navigate that for yourself, and what was the thing that motivated you?
I think the only way that I knew at the time how to navigate it was to sit in it, was
Mm,
just to be in whatever headspace or heart space I was in that moment. And it changed all the time. It changed day
mhm,
to day. It changed minute by minute. And I really just let myself feel the anger if I was angry or the hopelessness or the frustration or whatever it was. And until in that moment, I wasn't feeling it as much anymore.
mhm,
And obviously, it was talking about it. For me, that was, I think, the most obvious shift is once I got to a place emotionally where I felt like it was important to share the truth. I shared it,
mhm,
of course, with our daughters are grown now, but they were teenagers at the time when I found out. I didn't share it with them right away. I didn't talk about it with anyone
mhm,
easily for the first 3 years after I learned that truth. So I found out about his suicide in my mid-40s, I don't think I talked about it to anyone other than my mother and my husband until I was in my late 40s. And once I had talked about it with our daughters so that they could have that understanding of, okay, this is what really happened and this is what's in your DNA and these are the things that we all need to be talking openly about. Then I started then the ripple got wider
Mhm.
and I would talk to family members and friends and everyone who was in my orbit. And then eventually that was just a part of my new narrative of my life. And then everybody understood that. And I think it was in having those conversations, these kinds of conversations with people, not only just to share what my story was or what I
Mhm.
may have said or done, but it was so empowering to me to hear what people were saying back to me about similar situations that they had found themselves in or people that they had known who were in those kinds of situations or experiences that they had that were relevant in the same way. It was finding so much value in that sharing and that vulnerability that just I think is the thing that kind of pushed me into the space of saying, okay, now I'm sharing and it's impactful for people. What can I do now that's even more impactful? And then you do what you know. And in my
Mhm.
case, I'm a writer. So I started writing about it. I started talking about it, speaking about it, created a video series around it that's on YouTube, rebranded my entire work persona, if you
Mhm.
will, because I was a parenting writer for
Mhm.
almost a decade and I just made a hard shift into this mental health space and became an advocate. And then in my case, I just kept reaching these touch points where I was like, okay, I'm writing about it, but what else can I do? And
Mhm.
then when you're in these spaces like you and I are in, and these are the things that you're filling your feeds with and the conversations you're having, you find out what there is out there and what organizations may be doing the things that align with what you're doing. So I got connected with NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness here in Massachusetts, and I go around now as a storyteller and I tell my story
Mhm.
so that it benefits others who may be in similar situations. And I became a crisis counselor with the Trevor Project and have been on their lifelines for almost 2 years taking those calls. So now when
Mhm.
someone is suicidal or abused or scared to death to come out to their family, I'm on the other end and I can pay it forward in that way.
Yeah,
Yeah, those were all the things that just pushed me in the direction that I'm ultimately in now.
I appreciate that for sure. And I do want to come back to that transformation and that paying forward. But before going there, I do want to understand because at the end of the day, the impact it had on you, like the people that were the most impacted were yourself and your mother. And you
Mm,
said initially to make sense of it all, you were very cautious on in terms of who you were speaking to about this, right? And obviously you mentioned your mom's name.
mhm,
How were those conversations like with your mother? And because again, both of you likely had a different perspective on the situation, and I'm sure that's evolved over time, even from the beginning, right? So
mm.
what were those conversations like, and how were you supporting each other through those conversations?
Going back to the very, very first conversation, you keep in mind too, just for context for you, because you may not know and your listeners definitely wouldn't know. When this came out, it was very much by accident. I
Mm.
was never supposed to find out this
Hmm.
truth. This was something that in that moment when my father had died and my mother was the one to find him while I was off at day camp for the day, she made that decision because he was my best friend in the world. And now she had to tell me he was gone. And once she realized it was a suicide, there was another completely impossible layer to now
Hmm.
put on top of losing a father. Now it was for a different reason.
Hmm.
And she just in that moment said, I it's going to be hard enough for her as it is to know that he's gone. I have to just conceal this truth and tell her it was a heart attack and he was a smoker. So it didn't take much for me to
Hmm.
believe that. And I did. So when I found out, I think I don't know who was more in shock, my mother that I actually asked the question or me that I asked the question. I had a very chance encounter with a family member who asked me about my own kids, and just in a very innocuous way. And then out of nowhere, she asked me if my children had any of the same mental illness that my father had and depression. Didn't know what she was talking about. Was unaware. So it was shortly after that I had a conversation with my mother asking if he was depressed. And she said yes. And then before I even knew what I was about to say, I had already asked my mother if my dad had taken his life. And so that was the very first conversation.
Mm,
And I don't know which one of us was more stunned. So that was the first thing, was just this sense of everything being so surreal, everything being so unstable. Like, you're all of a sudden you're standing on solid ground, and then you're just sucked up by quicksand. That's the
mm,
feeling. My mother was very down on herself for a very long time after I learned the truth, because she had always vowed to herself that she would never tell me because she didn't
mhm,
want it to hurt me, but it also said she would never lie to me if I ever asked.
mhm,
So she just didn't want to cause me any more pain, and knew that I would have to relive this whole thing from a completely different angle. So the very first year's worth of conversations, now keep in mind, my mom and I are extremely close. We talk
mhm,
multiple times a day. She is my person in the world. We've talked about every aspect of this in every possible way in the
mhm,
past 10 years. But I think I spent most of those first several years trying to get her to not be so hard on herself for having
mm,
validated it,
mm,
because of how much pain she knew I was in.
mm,
So, yeah, but also too, at the same time, almost from the very beginning, I feel like my mother knew what my ultimate direction with this would be before I did, because it
yeah,
was very early on, before I had any inclination to write or talk about it, that my mother said, "You can write about this
mm,
or you can talk about this when you get to a point where you feel you can,
mm,
anytime you want, any way you want." And so a lot of our conversations were around my mother encouraging me to do what I needed to do with it, basically, which I know
mhm,
is a very simple thing to say, but it was a very powerful thing to hear from her, because she immediately just acknowledged it for everything that it was, and wanted me to do whatever I needed to do to go through it,
mhm,
navigate it, grieve it, I guess in the easiest way possible. Not that there is one, but
yeah,
yeah. So those first conversations were incredibly hard. And I remember my husband, when I came home that day, my mother and I think we sat in the parking lot of the restaurant we ate lunch at for hours when it all came out in my car, and then finally went home. And I called my husband to come out to the car, and I wanted my mother to just have a minute to just like decompress and just get her bearings. So she went in the house, and I called my husband out. And I remember when he got in the car, he just dialed right in and knew something was up. And I said, "You need to drive. We need to go out for a drive. I need to tell you something." And
mhm,
when I told him what I had discovered, he didn't believe it.
mm,
Didn't believe it in the way that he just thought it was impossible. Like, how are you sure that you didn't misunderstand something?
mhm,
Or is it indisputable? And I remember when I said my mom found a note, he was like, "Oh shit."
mm,
Okay. So we know. Yeah,
mhm,
that was really what happened. And then he just held all the space in the world for me for the last
mhm.
10 years.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
amazing. Yeah, and as you're sharing that aspect or the story there with in terms of how you were able to discuss it with your mom, what I'm getting out is the level of empathy and acceptance you have, because obviously for a person to be in that situation where not only do you find this note, but then you have to relay that information to your 10-year-old daughter, that's a
Yeah.
lot. But there's the other aspect. I wonder if this was something you also encountered. Was there any anger or resentment towards your mom for not telling you the truth right away and making a decision on your behalf that you had to live with for all these years until it came out? And again, how did you then go from that to the level of acceptance and empathy you have today?
Such a valid question. It's something that I, even after all this time, think about often and talk about often. From the minute that I learned the truth about my father's suicide. You got to keep in mind, I lost him the first time when I was a 10-year-old kid. The second time I lost him, I was in my mid 40s. I had been married for 20 years. I had two teenage daughters. So I was a completely different person. I had a much different capacity for understanding and processing and grieving and all the things. I understood in that exact moment as a mom why my mother did what she did. I never, from the moment that I learned the truth, had the slightest bit, never had the slightest bit of animosity or anger or resentment toward my mother for keeping that secret. To me, honestly, and we've talked about this even recently, she and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I would have survived it if I
Mm-hmm.
had found out that my dad had taken his life, just because of how I felt about suicide, because of how angry I was, because of how raw the experience was. I If I had ever found out that he had taken his life, I'm not sure I would have made it. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm so grateful for her presence of mind in that moment to keep that from me. Whether she planned on doing it when I was older, which I think she did at some points in her life, she was like, maybe I can talk to her about it now. But there was always a good reason not to. Like, I'm about to graduate from high school and then I'm going off to college and now I'm getting married. So then it became, what's the real point? How will that impact her life? But I understood in that moment exactly why she did what she did,
Mm-hmm.
and I have nothing but gratitude
Mm-hmm.
to my mom for doing that. I would have made the same decision in that moment. Even knowing what I do know now, I
Mm-hmm.
would have made the same decision. I most likely, knowing what I know now and living in the world that we're in now, where we're far more open and honest about the subject, I probably would have tried to find a way at some point when my children were older to tell them,
Mm-hmm.
but I absolutely got it,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that takes a lot of courage to have that level of compassion for another individual, and considering even finding out at that point in your life the impact it had on you, still to be able to put yourself in her shoes and be like, okay, yeah, I get it. That's
Mhm.
huge. And one of the things I've been discussing quite a bit with people lately is this whole idea of meaning and how things transpire in our lives. And we tend to question things as they're happening. And sometimes we don't really make sense of it even after the fact. But the biggest piece, and where people really find contentment and acceptance and just pure joy, is just knowing that things are happening as they're meant to happen, right? Things are
Mhm.
happening, we're getting what we need, not often what we want. And that's okay. And having that level of acceptance can really transform our lives. And it sounds like that's how you're looking at it, in terms of things happen the way they needed to happen. And now you've taken this as an opportunity to really transform not only your life, but pay it forward, as you said. And what's that? How's that chapter of your life going now? Because you did share some of the work you're doing, but how has it been, and how rewarding has it been for you?
You know, it's interesting that you're asking that question now because recently, like within the last week or two, I had a conversation with my mom specifically about some of the work I'm doing. I've been writing for a publishing company in California, Familius Publishing, for a long time. We've written a bunch of books together. I just recently, this spring actually, signed another contract to write a book about this experience with my father, this loss. And I had this conversation right after I signed with them to write this book with my mom, where we were talking just about exactly what you and I are talking about now. And I said, I feel so much more empowered, inspired, motivated than I have ever felt with anything. And I've always loved everything, everything I've ever written about, whether I was writing about parenting or work-life balance or anything like that, relationships. I've always loved the work I do. There's something so different about this work.
Mm-hmm.
This work is work that I really genuinely now believe that I'm doing with my dad. Like I truly do feel like he's somehow there typing alongside me, talking alongside me. It's a strange infusion that I've gotten of energy ever since I decided to walk on this path. It's like the more I do, the more I want to do. And the more that I see what I'm putting out into the world impacting other people, whether it be as a crisis counselor or telling a story or I write a column here in Boston, whether it's that, any of the feedback that I get, it just makes me realize I'm exactly in the right place doing the right thing that I'm meant to be doing. And the only conflict I have with that, which is hard, is the idea that nobody wants this to be their sweet spot. Nobody wants
Mhm.
this to be their life's work necessarily because of the reason why. Like that underlying reason is because I've lost my father and so many other people this way.
Mhm.
And that's a shitty reason. But
Mhm.
at the end of the day, my mom has this expression, you play the hand you're dealt,
Mhm.
and you can't control that. And what you do with that hand is what really matters. And so I'm just trying to play my hand the best way that I can so that not just for myself, it's not for myself at all. It's for my children, for the people who hear the interviews I give or read the books that I write. And if something that I've gone through or something I've learned can benefit someone else, and that's that's it for me.
Mhm.
That's my why.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely, and I appreciate that. Interestingly enough, I was having a similar conversation with a friend of mine yesterday, and we were just talking about our parents being at that age and how much time they have left, and trying to figure out how to have meaningful conversations with them because there's that notion around what was our purpose, right? Existential question around that, and we're talking about this idea of at least this is something I've formulated around how you can live forever, right? In a way. And just being able to relay that to my parents that all the sacrifices you made or all the work you put in, everything you've done is going to have an eternal impact through your children. And
Mhm.
the things I'm doing, it's going to go further out. And we'll see it through my children and then the people that we're all impacting. So every little thing you do does have that eternal impact. And often we lose sight of that. But that's what I'm hearing from you as well in terms of the work you're doing and the influence of your father and you being that vessel of putting it out there. Is that something you've been able to reconcile for yourself? I know you're sharing that in terms of the energy you're able to experience when you're doing this work, but how does that feel that his legacy is going to live on?
Oh, it's beautiful to me.
Hmm.
It's a gift to me in every possible way. I think I've had those same existential questions in rolling around in my mind since I can remember having thoughts at all when I was a little kid. And certainly when you're faced with mortality at such a young age, it's not a typical thing that a child
Hmm.
is 10 and loses a parent. That's somewhat unusual.
Hmm.
Because of that, obviously, it changed my life in ways that you would expect, but it also changed my life in ways that you wouldn't necessarily think of. Like I grew up overnight. I had no choice. I was an only child. My mother was left with an incredible amount of responsibility. And I lost a bit of my childhood, not through any fault of my mother's. My mother did
Hmm.
everything humanly possible to give me the most beautiful and rich, supported life. And she continues to do that to this day. But the fact of the matter is, when you lose a parent, you're traumatized and you're scarred forever. Scars fade, but they never really go away, and
Hmm.
you just learn to live with them in different ways. To think that after all this time, I can take this terrible thing that happened to me, and it will always be a terrible thing that happened to me, but there can be some good that comes from it in the sense that I can share this story with someone else who maybe is afraid to share theirs, and maybe
Hmm.
that motivates them to open up. Or I can encourage people to utilize tools like therapy, which I went back into therapy after 30 years. And it's the greatest gift that I've given myself to be able to spend that hour with my therapist every week. Not that that my mother and my stepdad and my husband and kids aren't incredibly loving and supportive, they are. But
Mhm.
there's something unique about having someone in your life who is unbiased, who has experience, and who has the education and the tools to help you navigate things in a totally different way.
Mm.
If I can share a story or a lived experience or a coping strategy that helped me, and maybe I'm farther along in my grief journey than someone else is, that's the whole point. So I think of this as a gift. It's funny. I often wondered as my kids aged out of. I wrote about my kids a lot when they were young, and then when they went off to college, and then I got to this place where I was like, okay, what do I really want to do? What do I really want to write about? And how do I want to pivot as I get older? And I guess, the serendipitous of this happened, and it just brought me to a new place.
Mhm.
Yeah, feeling a lot of gratitude for that.
Yeah, for sure. And early on, we talked about the shame around suicide, right? There's a lot of shame, and in most cases, people keep it a secret for many reasons. There's the other aspect where a lot of the times when I've talked to people who've been directly impacted, there's that common response that I didn't see it coming. Everything seemed fine. So to me, that's also an aspect of shame where the individual themselves probably aren't feeling comfortable sharing that, hey, this is something that's going on. These are the thoughts that are going through my head. And then you talked about just sharing your story and how it might help someone, or some of the conversations you're having on the helplines with people, trying to change that narrative around shame with this thing. And how can we collectively do that as well?
I think the way that we change any narrative is by having open and honest conversations about it, like we're
Mhm.
doing right now. Shame is a tricky thing. It can corrupt our headspace, it can corrupt our actions. And I think the only way to really discourage someone from falling into that pit that shame is by sharing our own fears and our own challenges and struggles, and by being vocal and honest about those things. When we're vulnerable about that, people understand that we're human. They recognize that we're human. And I think that it's that focus on our humanity and the fact that we're all flawed anyway. It doesn't matter who we are or what we do, how much money we have or don't have, what position we have in life. Like, we're all innately flawed, and that's okay. That's a good thing. If we had it all figured out, it would be a pretty damn boring life in a lot of ways. And it's by sharing within either our kind of immediate community, as in family, friends, or our wider community. By doing that, you create that safety net where it becomes okay. It's now become kind of cliche to say it's okay to not be okay, but that's really what it is. I think shame is a tough thing to navigate. It really is. And I think that the only way that we dilute its power is by being open about the things that we're shameful of,
Mm-hmm.
and recognizing that we all have some version of those things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're touching about vulnerability, it's so crucial because I see that in the groups that I'm facilitating, or even in the therapeutic sessions. Just being vulnerable takes the pressure off people because, like you said, then we're able to connect at that human level, and we're not trying to create this facade of acting like we have it all figured out,
Mhm.
which often creates a lot of problems. And at the end of the day, as humans, all we want is to be seen, heard, and understood. And that vulnerability allows for that. And it can break a lot of barriers. But the other thing you're touching on is that permission. And sometimes when we role model the fact that we are giving ourselves permission to feel, it's allowing others to also grasp onto that, okay, I can I also have the permission to feel. And then there's no shame will often block us from that, and then we fall into that shame spiral, and it's just a never ending cycle, unfortunately. But that's really it, is that permission and giving it to
Mhm.
ourselves first,
Mhm.
right? And role modeling that for others. And I've seen that power of that even in the group settings where there's multiple people who in their head they've created this narrative that the issues I'm going through are terrible and no one will understand. But then when you start hearing other people's stories, just like you're sharing yours, you're like, okay, it's not too bad, right? If this person went through this, then I can talk about what I'm going through. And that permission again comes through. How
Yeah.
are you doing that in terms of the, you said the content that you're now creating has shifted and it's more focused on the mental health? What are some things that you focus on as far as your content goes?
So my content is very, I don't want to say mismatched because it's not mismatched at all. It does have a pretty decent synergy. I just do a lot of different things in a lot of different spaces. I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I started doing is actually coming up on a year now that I've been doing this. I have a video series on
Mm-hmm.
YouTube called the Suicide Survivor Series. And it's short videos that I drop every Monday, about 90 seconds or less. And they're really just thoughts or feelings or experiences or perceptions about my life, the life of a survivor, because obviously, along with suicide and mental illness comes grief and loss at times. And so I have a lot of experience in all of those spaces. So I write about that and I record a lot about that. That's one way. Obviously, I write an awful lot of articles for a lot of different online platforms and publications. Um, and I have my own regular column here in Boston called We Are Who We Are. That's really an extension of everything that I do
Mm-hmm.
on videos or in conversations like this. It's really just a place for me to have kind of a static, one-sided conversation about what's going on in my head that I know is going on in other people's heads. I know other people are thinking about life and death and mental illness and how to grieve and how to maintain a work-life balance, and that it's okay to seek help and all of those things. Like, we're all grappling with the same things. We're just not all talking about them in the mainstream. So this column is a way of every week or every installment is really just another bigger overarching question. One of the ones that I wrote recently was, how do you help someone who just wants to die?
Mm,
That's not a conversation starter that most people are throwing out
right.
into the average coffee conversation that you
Yeah.
have. But they're conversations, though, that we really need to be having. So I'm trying to have the hard ones to show that it really not only is okay to have them, but it's necessary, because that's how we change the bigger, broader narrative of mental illness and just of stigma in general. That's how we mainstream all of these things that have been shoved in the darkness for so long. And when we take things out from the depths of our own head, you mentioned how it's such a toxic place sometimes to be in our own heads. It is. It's,
Mm-hmm.
it's like a never ending cycle because we're there all alone and we're recycling the same, in some cases, negative or toxic thought patterns. And it's when we put them out in the air, whether it's we write about them or we talk about them or we share those thoughts and feelings, that's when we can actually collaborate with other people around those things. We
Mm-hmm.
can work with other people, get other people's perceptions, experiences, opinions about them, and in some ways, maybe
Mm-hmm.
soften what's weighing on us a little bit, lighten what's weighing on us a little bit.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it does take the
So
pressure off.
that's just a way to bring other people into the conversation that makes us realize we're not alone in what we're
Mm-hmm.
feeling.
Yes, and I think that's been the biggest thing, and the reason why I wanted to do this podcast was because when I was going through my own struggles, I felt I was alone. And it was through conversations and being open and vulnerable that I felt like I wasn't. And how can we create that platform for others to even just tuning in on someone else's conversation feel okay, I'm not the only one going through this, and there is always someone that's willing to listen and I can go talk to. And sometimes it is your therapist, right? And that was something that really helped me as well at the time. Now, there's something I do want to come back to. You mentioned again, as far as touching on it again, in terms of the energy you feel when you're writing, in terms of
Mm.
some sort of presence. And one of the things I like to talk about on this podcast as well, because it does help people on their mental health journey, is some sort of spiritual connection. And that can mean many different things for people. And I don't believe there's only one way about it. At the end of the day, I think it doesn't matter how you do it as long as you get there. And
Mhm.
that in itself is a journey and a process. But is there a form of meaning and connection you've been able to make that's helped you, and in terms of what this relationship with your father means? And even though he's no longer here, is there something beyond that's taking place?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually had a conversation about this in therapy last week, just last week. We were having that kind of afterlife
Mm-hmm.
dialogue, and I really have always believed that the human soul and the human spirit is just it's too strong to disappear.
Mm-hmm.
I don't believe, and this is look, anything that I'm saying right now obviously is my own personal belief. I'm
Absolutely.
I'm a practicing Jew, but I'm a very reformed practicing Jew. I'm way more spiritual than I am practicing. And I just have such a strong belief that when our time here in that physical vessel that we all have is gone, is over, that we transcend, we go somewhere. I do believe that. In some ways, I believe that we go into the people who we've been with all along.
Mm-hmm.
And then part of us finds our way to the people who we've lost over the course of our life. So in my mind, it's an abstract feeling, but it's a
Yeah.
very strong feeling to me of what happens. And in the case of my father, one of the things that I loved the most about my relationship with him was that he was an incredible outdoorsman. He he raced cars as a hobby. He was always out in nature. He was an avid mountaineer. I joined him when from a very young age. I started climbing mountains when I was 4 or 5 years old with my dad and have spent and we're, here on the East Coast, so we've got the White Mountains in New Hampshire. And I spent my entire childhood with him up in those mountains and in those spaces and places and find myself to this day feeling the most connected to my dad when I'm in those places. So I try very intentionally to put myself in those places where I know the connection is strong. Other things that I started doing, I journal a lot. I've always journaled since
Mm-hmm.
probably since I was old enough to hold a pencil. And I recently, this was not something I ever really did before, but my therapist had given me a great idea of writing my dad a letter
Mm.
and just don't think, just write. And I've done an awful lot of that lately. And writing with my, I'm a lefty, so I write with my left hand, asking my father questions and then answering those questions with my right hand instead and activating that part of my brain. So I do all these funky little things to try and feel closer to him. And certainly, obviously, when I'm writing, especially in the process of writing this book, like I have to go right back to that day, to that afternoon, finding out that he was gone the first time, and then the day I found out it was a suicide. All of those places are hard to go, but
Mm-hmm.
it's been incredibly comforting to feel like he's with me now when I go there. So it's not quite as scary to make
Yeah.
that trip.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I'm assuming that's been a huge part of your healing as well.
Mhm. Yeah, writing for me has always been one of the most cathartic things in the world for me. That and being out in nature, whether I'm running or hiking or skiing or walking, that combined with this this practice, lifelong practice of putting my feelings on paper, putting them in a place. And it's not because I ever intend to go back and read them. It's not because I'm leaving some stack of journals for my kids because they don't read the books I write now. Why would they read my journals?
Yeah.
But it's for me. It's an outlet. It's the old you bleed a radiator, the old fashioned radiator, so they don't blow. So I write what's in my head or in my heart. So it has a channel, it has a place to go. And it's incredibly cathartic and therapeutic. And there are definitely times when I really do believe that when I've written to my dad, the answers that I get back are coming from him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's amazing. I know we've covered a lot, Lisa. Is there anything else you wanted to add that you think would be of value to the listeners in terms of whether they're struggling, they feel like they're alone, or they know someone who's going through that? And yeah, we all want to support others that we know, and put out a helping hand. What are some of those things around that you could share?
I think it's just incredibly important to be paying attention to the people that you care about
Mm-hmm.
because some of them will seem like they've got it absolutely all together and they're in a good place and they're thriving and maybe they're not. Those are actually the people who I feel like we need to worry about the most
Mm-hmm.
because they are the ones who are less likely to be open about things not being good. And then obviously you're paying attention to the people who like we all have the people in our life who are open and who are honest about not being okay. And we need to take those people seriously and validate how they feel. And I think at the end of the day, we just, whether it's someone who's open or not open, we just need to be checking in with the people who matter in our life and asking them sometimes the hard questions, especially the people who are telling you that they're not okay. Like you might need to take it a step further and say, are you thinking about harming yourself? Have you done anything to harm
Mm-hmm.
yourself? Those are really tough questions, but they are the most important questions that we have to be asking. And I think a lot of people are afraid of asking. You want to be there for your friends, you want to hold space for your family, but we often get, I think, a little paralyzed by the idea of doing that because we're afraid of like, oh my God, what the hell do I do if this person says I'm not okay? Or even worse, like, yeah, I've thought about taking my life or try to take my life. What I would say to people who are listening is you're not alone either
Mm-hmm.
in offering help. It's not your place to fix the problem, your friend or your family member's problem. It's not up to you to have some grand plan that saves them. What you need to be doing is just showing up for them, having a safe place for them to unload how they're feeling. And what you can always have in your back pocket, whether you're the person who's listening to someone who's struggling or you're the person who's struggling yourself, call the 988 suicide hotline here in the United States. Every country has their own
Mm-hmm.
suicide crisis hotline. I have a list of them on my own website. Anyone can find any resource in any country that you're in that you're listening to this in. And I think that's the most important thing is just having that resource because those are the people who are trained to give the support and to provide the resources and to get extra help from. So that's what I'd say. Check in on your people and then keep that lifeline number in your phone handy. Keep it on your mind.
Yes. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Lisa, so much for this conversation and sharing your story and being so vulnerable. I know this is something you aspire to do, but I'm always grateful when people are able to come on here and do that. I know you've mentioned a lot of ways you're contributing and putting stuff out there. What are some ways people can find your work, or even if they wanted to get a hold of you, what are some ways they can do that?
I think the very best way is just directly through my website, lisasugarman.com. That's where all my socials filter through there. My YouTube channel filters through there. My column is posted there every week. All the archives of all the past columns that I've written, books that I've written, all of it's there. I mean, I'm on all the socials and those handles are on my website as well. And you can reach out to me directly. I also have a very comprehensive and very inclusive resource hub on my website that's split into about 16 different categories for the BIPOC community, the queer community, children, teens, veterans, elderly, Asian community, with resources specific to that community
Mhm.
and tools that I've curated to help people when you're low and you need help. So all of that is in the resource hub, and you can find all of it on my website.
Awesome. I will put that in the show note captions. But Lisa, thank you again. This was a pleasure, and I really enjoyed this conversation.
You're so welcome, and I'm just grateful to have been invited to have it.